Before we get started this afternoon, several members of the rugby team would like to come on stage and make a special presentation.
So as you guys know, Professor Rocha is our head rugby coach, so we just decided that we would frame one of the brand new jerseys we got this year for him as a thank you for all the work he's done with the program. So.
Speaking today in chapel is Professor of Teacher Education and Philosophy, Dr. Sam Rocha. He's the Owen Duston Visiting Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Teacher Education and Head Coach of the Wabash Rugby Football Club and an honorary member of the Malcolm X Institute of Black Studies. Next year, Dr. Rocha will matriculate to the University of North Dakota as an Assistant Professor of Educational Foundations and Research. Dr. Rocha has written over 20 academic publications, a self-published book of essays, a co-authored chapbook of poetry, and over 200 contributions to the Catholic weblog Vox Nova. In his past 2 years at Wabash, Dr. Rocha has given numerous campus talks, invited lectures, and conference presentations, and has published articles or interviews in nearly every Wabash publication. Dr. Rocha enjoys food, music, fishing, and cold beer, especially all at once. Here to give his talk titled From Adios to Dios, Goodbye Wabash, is Dr. Sam Rocha.
I hope you all know that award was kind of a prank, I was going to try and really keep myself held together here, and they basically already got me teary-eyed a little bit. So I got to kind of gather myself here. I'd like to begin by giving a very particular thank you to Lexi Hurl. Because of my own scheduling snafus, I was actually scheduled to give the talk last week when I realized that I was supposed to be in Vancouver, and kind of maybe a week, 2 weeks beforehand sent her an email seeing if there was anything we could do. And as you saw in her really beautiful talk last week, that talk was really meant to be given today. And so in many ways, her talk was already more generous and more beautiful than it even was already, because it was basically given from a very serious place of generosity. In other words, she was already conceding to me this particular day with you, in particular with the seniors whom she loves so much and that she spoke about last week. And so I'd like to thank Lexi Hurl very much for letting me give this talk today. Yeah. I'd also like to thank Lexi for messing up my talk for today. The tone, the content, the sentiment of her talk was, for me, very moving, and it caused me to put down all of my notes and all of my scribbles and my manuscript and just come to you today just like this, no manuscript, just to tell you some stories and maybe sing a song for you. And those who haven't seen Lexi's talk, I hope you go and you see it. It's really important, I think. So I want this goodbye to be given in the form of a hello. And what I mean by that is that I want this goodbye to be given in the form of a personal introduction. Some of you have taken my classes, and those of you who have talked to me otherwise know that for me, the phenomena of self-disclosure, whenever a person tells you something about themselves in text through autobiographies, memoirs, biographies, confessionals, those sorts of genres, for me are an important starting point for beginning to ask and understand and think about philosophical questions, but more than just philosophical questions, to just think about the world and about a lot of things. And one of the things that I know I haven't always done so well is practiced the genre of confessionals or autobiographies or biographies. In some ways, as big a mouth as I have, I can also be fiercely private about some things. And in my last chance, I wouldn't want to leave without introducing myself, I guess. So it's sort of an ironic goodbye. But the goodbye begins with my parents. My dad was born a bastard son, a son without, never knew his father, and was adopted by my grandma and grandpa, who my grandma passed away while I was here, who were the last generation of vaquero families, rancher families, to live in San Isidro, which is sort of in the upper part of the Rio Grande Valley. My grandpa on a horse ranch and my grandmother also on a horse ranch. And they moved into the town, and they worked as migrant farmers during the summer months, and in a bodega, or in a I don't know, what do you call it? Packing shed, I guess. My grandma tied carrot tops a lot, and my grandpa loaded boxes a lot. And in fact, when I got the job here, I talked to my grandma, and she was really excited about the fact that I had gotten a job at Wabash, Indiana. She didn't make the distinction between Wabash, Indiana, and Wabash College, but that's just a silly detail. Because they had been here before, whenever they would, go picking. I believe it was either cucumbers or tomatoes. So she was very familiar and friendly to Indiana, right? And that was neat. Anyhow, my father then grew up in town with my grandparents as an only child until he was about 13 or 14, and he got into those of you who are familiar with the Valley know it's kind of a rough place. And my father's generation is a lot of the reason why it's such a rough place. My dad was a heroin addict until he was 28 years old. And at the age of 28, he had this very powerful religious conversion experience within the Catholic Church, and also not just within the Catholic Church, but within the charismatic renewal that was at that time just starting in the Catholic Church. And on account of it, he was able to go basically cold turkey off of both heroin and also methadone, which he was receiving at a clinic for heroin addicts. Anyhow, so my dad then tried to become a priest, but wasn't any good at his studies, so he then decided to become a missionary. And his mission travels took him to Utah, where he met my mother, who was something of a finding herself hippie, born into a ironically similar family situation as my father. My maternal grandparents, both of whom are still alive, the maiden name is Montaño, were Spanish agrarian sheep herder type people who, and my grandparents on my maternal side are the first generation of that side who moved into town as well. And so my grandfather went from sheep herder to coal truck driver to small business owner to very kind of upper middle class, kind of self-made kind of guy. And my parents met, and they fell in love, and they decided to get married and become missionaries together. One of the reasons why was because the doctors were all very adamant to my father especially that he shouldn't get any delusions about having children of his own, because of his drug use. They kind of said that's probably out of the question. And they also said that if you do ever conceive a child, you can be almost guaranteed that it's going to have severe birth defects, among them mental retardation. So they had me. It was obviously a trying time. It was unexpected. And at the time, my parents had moved to Brownsville, Texas, and so that's where I was born, right on the border of Matamoros, Mexico. And my dad was given a job as a janitor at Good Shepherd Catholic Church in Brownsville, but with the agreement that he would be paid for his janitorial work, but allowed to do kind of ministerial work in the evenings and stuff like that. And so around the time of my birth, my dad was told by Father John O'Malley, the priest who baptized me, that Noe, you're awful janitor, but you're a very good pastoral assistant. So he got fired and promoted all at once. Within 2 years of being born in Brownsville, we moved to Brigham, Utah, where Bishop Wiegand, who my dad had been working with as a missionary, asked him to come back. And Utah's closer to my mom's side of the family, so they moved over there for 2 years. After 2 years of being there, we moved to Lorain, Ohio, under the sponsorship of Father Michael Schneid, and my dad worked as a pastoral assistant in Sacred Heart Catholic Church, which is a kind of territorial church for primarily Puerto Rican, but for Spanish-speaking Catholics in the area. While we were at Sacred Heart, my family decided and got involved in a covenant charismatic community, which drew us eventually down to Mexico. But before it drew us to Mexico, it drew my father out of Sacred Heart and into a non-for-profit kind of self-employed missionary. So in a very strange way, I grew up in a Catholic lay, unaffiliated with Mary Knoll or anything like that family. After almost 5 years in Lorain, we moved to Mexico, where we would stay between Mexico and the Rio Grande Valley while my grandfather was sick for a while, for 5 more years there. So by the time I'm entering 7th grade, I've actually matriculated through 9 different schools. And the schools included homeschooling for 1 year in kindergarten, a lot of Catholic schools who my parents would kind of say, hey, we're missionaries, can we go here for free? And they say, yeah, for like a year, and then we go to another one. And Mexican public schools, which that was an adventure. I kind of just didn't go to school for 2 years, actually, 5th and 6th grade. And when I arrived in Brady, Texas in 7th grade, it was kind of a new time for my family. My dad was giving up the living on donations, missionary kind of mendicant family lifestyle, and he took a job as a pastoral coordinator in Brady, Texas, in the Diocese of San Angelo. And the reason for this was because of the lack of priests in that diocese. They were beginning to employ nuns, but in this case, some lay people. My dad was actually the first layman to be hired as a pastoral coordinator, and so he took care of the sort of day-to-day things and then brought in priests for the weekends to celebrate Mass and hear confessions and things like that. And we got there like in August, and school was starting, I believe, like in 2 days or something. So I'd been living in Mexico for 2 really solid years, and a few more years even before that. I hadn't studied, much. I'd just been mostly reading books and playing guitar, but I certainly hadn't done many studies formal studies, at least in English whatsoever. Luckily, my parents didn't tell any of this to the administrators whenever they enrolled us into school, or I probably would have been put in probably into special ed or something. But instead, just enrolled me into kind of the usual docket of classes. Because my dad's position at the church, a lot of people around town kind of knew about us and knew where we came from and what have you. And this begins my first kind of story, and it's about my coach, Coach Villa, Coach Oscar Villa. We used to call him Pancho Villa behind his back. But Coach Villa grew up in West Texas in a kind of agrarian Mexican immigrant family. By the way, I didn't grow up in an immigrant family. My family's been in Texas longer than Texas has been in the United States. So if you were to tell my grandpa to go back where he came from, he'd actually go north, not south. But that's a side note. Coach Villa had heard about me and was clearly concerned about helping me transition into Texas public schools, into a small town, into English speaking. They actually, I think, vastly underestimated how good my English was. I think they were expecting me to be kind of, I don't speak no English, but I was very fluent in English, right? It was actually it was my first language till like 2nd grade, so I'm not like in the sort of strict sense, not a native speaker, right? Anyhow, Coach Villa came up to me one morning while I was sitting in the cafeteria, drinking my pint of chocolate milk and eating some awful those French toast sticks they give people, right? Anyway, I was eating that, and he walked up to me and started talking to me in Spanish, which I was a little shy about. I didn't want to like advertise, right, that I just been living in Mexico for a while. But we talked a little bit, and he handed me a form and said, this is to get your physical. They won't charge you any money if you go to Dr. Castro. Go and get your physical because you're going to play football. And I was like, oh, cool. So I got taken to the doctor's office, was given a physical, surprise, right? I didn't know all that stuff was in it. Anyway, I came back, didn't know about the coughing test. Came back and started to play football. Turned out that I was a really good 138-pound defensive lineman. I was I didn't know the rules to football. I didn't have contacts or rec specs, so I played basically blind. He goes, you on the rugby team, know how that goes. And I had no idea what really downs were, and I couldn't see the scoreboard. So I just played every down just trying to like tackle the quarterback before he handed off the ball, right? This kind of like wild thing. It's 7th grade, right? So it worked out pretty well. But one thing I wasn't aware of was that in West Texas, there was a lot of racial tension. And that came to a head unbeknownst to me one day whenever I witnessed through a window and heard later a lot about it, that Coach Villa basically tried to get into a fight with the head coach of the junior high football team because I was being pulled out of the game at a very kind of irregular pace. But Coach Villa was the defensive coordinator, right? And so the head coach kept pulling me out of the game without talking to Coach Villa. And Coach Villa's interpretation of the matter after a few games was basically that I was starting in front of Chase Pilgrim, a friend of mine from back home, bigger guy, more prototypical defensive lineman, I guess, or what have you, but also a white guy. And Coach Villa took that as basically a racial issue. And after 3 games of getting pulled out, in particular in a game against Burnett, Texas, he just confronted the coach on it and called him out and said, I know what you're doing, Rocha. And Coach Villa's like 5'6", but he's a tough son of a bitch. And he basically said, let's go right now. I'm going to fight you. And an assistant coach broke him up and kind of told him to kind of go to the respective corners. But that day I learned something. Well, first of all, I learned that Coach Villa was like, I could trust him, right? I also learned about some other things. But it was the first time I'd ever had any interaction like this with a teacher or a coach, what have you. First time I had the feeling of being loved in a very particular kind of a way by a teacher, right? I never really thought of teachers that way. So there's that. Coach V actually goes on to become my confirmation sponsor, and his son Nick and I become really close friends. And to this day, if I'm ever in Brady, I just stay at the Villas. I don't even tell them I'm coming, right? I just go there. So then I go into high school, and I have to move my junior year to Abilene Wiley, where I graduated from my senior year. And I matriculate to Franciscan University of Steubenville, which for those of you who are super Catholics in the room know that's where the really weird, charismatic, and kind of super Catholics go, right? And so I went there because I was raised in that family, so Franciscan might as well have been Princeton. I mean, that was where, that's where the Holy Ghost lives, right? So you go there. So I went to Franciscan, and I went there on a sort of very informal scholarship agreement that Sam can come here, he can enroll, he can take classes. If he knocks it out of the park his first year because he seems like a good student, then we'll give him another year, kind of like this almost like Rudy Rudiger kind of arrangement. Well, in the process, I also applied for every scholarship under the sun, and one of them was this scholarship that was in the second year from the Bill and Melinda Gates Scholarship Foundation called the Gates Millennium Scholarship. And I was notified once I had already arrived at Franciscan that I got the scholarship. And I didn't know until they flew me out to DC that it was kind of a big deal. And I'll come back to the scholarship thing later. But while I was at Franciscan, I studied philosophy, but because I had so many credits from this CLEP test thing I took that gave me like 12 credit hours in Spanish, I was able to skip all of the sort of grammar and syntax portion of the major and begin taking Spanish literature courses. And I took them for a lot of reasons. One of them was that Dr. Spinnenweber, Doctora Spinnenweber, she just seemed like a goddess to me. I mean, she was just like this like amazing, tough, mean, intense, just looking woman, and I couldn't imagine what she would be like in the classroom. And the classroom didn't disappoint. She was a Princeton Hispanist who also had degrees in Russian, and she was hardcore about the Spanish, the Romantic era in Spain. And so I primarily took my courses with Spinnenweber. Another reason I took my courses with Spinnenweber is she kind of had a bad rap at Franciscan. Franciscan was a deeply Catholic and deeply religious and very kind of extroverted religious place. And so whenever you started class, it was customary that we started just about every class with a prayer, either a spontaneous one or one that we always would use. And Spinnenweber didn't do that. So immediately she was kind of like seen as kind of a potential heretic or something. And so everyone was kind of like worried about her soul and all these kinds of things, right? And I felt basically I was attracted to it, but I wasn't sort of attracted. I don't know what was going on there. It just, so I took her classes, and I always kind of was a little bit like aloof about her, whether she was a good teacher because she didn't pray before classes and all these really weird things, to you sounding weird, but for me, absolutely normal, right? And one day in class, she was, and by the way, her classes were so hard. I mean, she kicked me all over the place, right? Yeah, I knew Spanish, but conversational Spanish and diagramming poems are two completely different things, right? And one day, we were working on some verses by Teresa of Avila, and she began to just read one within the regular routine of the class, and in the middle of her reading, she visibly choked up, and one tear like kind of glanced across her cheek, and she just kind of hit it off and kept going. And I was just paralyzed, though, in that moment that, wow, Spinnenweber just cried. I mean, amazing. And you guys must think, well, Rocha, you cry all the time. But I didn't know that yet, right? I didn't know I would be like this. Maybe that's why. But in that just instant of a moment when Spinnenweber showed a part of herself, disclosed something about her feelings about poetry, about Teresa of Avila, it was also a deeply spiritual, deeply religious poem. I was not only completely convinced that I had nothing to worry about with Spinnenweber with regards to, eschatology or what have you, soteriology, but that she was someone that I could look to as more than just an idol, that someone I could look to as a model, as a teacher, and so that's that. So I go in to graduate from Franciscan. I don't, by the way, have the best grades in the world, and I was not sort of the greatest student. I was sort of the guy who everyone was like, yeah, Roach is really smart, but he well, we'll just see about that. Just kind of one of these sort of test cases. So I enrolled at University of St. Thomas, basically because I had to get my grades up in order to if I wanted to go to graduate school, but I wasn't really necessarily thinking about graduate school. At that point, I was thinking about getting married, right? And so I did, and we moved to the Twin Cities, and I began teaching K through 8 Spanish. My Spanish degree got me my first job, not my philosophy degree. And I taught kindergarten through 8th grade at Transfiguration Catholic School. And while I was there, I discovered through my studies at University of St. Thomas that basically I was probably not a philosopher, but I definitely also wasn't an educationalist. So I was going to have to split the difference, right? And so philosophy of education was sort of, I thought it was a joke. Like, really? There's a thing called philosophy of education, right? But they said, go to some conference, see what you think about it. I went. As a result of the first conference I went to and presented at, and I didn't know, by the way, that as a master's student, I'm not supposed to be presenting at conferences, but I just wrote a paper and submitted it, and they accepted it, so I presented it. And afterwards, there were 3 people in the room, but one of those 3 was Phil Smith, who would go on to be my advisor at Ohio State, and who, after hearing that paper, recruited me just no holds barred, to Ohio State. Once I knew I was going to Ohio State, though, I kind of had this moment of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to move my family from Minnesota to Columbus, and I don't even know really what this field is that I'm going to go get a PhD in. I don't know who these people are that live in this space. So I went to Chicago just to see a conference. I went to the APA, the Central Division meeting. They had a special session on philosophy of education there. And they were having a very highly idiosyncratic, but now I've come to find very comfortable, for me at least, conversation about desserts. And I don't mean pie. I mean things that were owed, right? So the concept of dessert in philosophy is how you negotiate and the kind of political question of whether you owe people things and whether people have rights and all that kind of stuff, right? So the question in this session that I'm observing is, do teachers owe something to their students? And what is the nature, if this dessert exists at all, if students have desserts from their teachers, what is the nature of these desserts? How can we analytically justify them? How can we analytically make sense out of them? How can we describe them? Such and such, blah, 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 right? So if you're familiar with philosophers, and especially some forms of analytic philosophers, they love to create these mind experiments, right? These thought experiments that kind of blow up the conversation, right? Or send it into a different direction. And this was right after the Virginia Tech shootings. It was like right on the cusp of that. And someone in the session said, well, there's a real story, this isn't a thought experiment, of one of the two main places that the shooter went during the massacre. There was an emeritus professor, a survivor of the Holocaust, who would come back and teach like one course a year at Virginia Tech. And when the shooter came down his hallway and he heard the gunshots, he immediately shut the door, locked it, told his students to jump out the window, and when the shooter tried to enter the room, he pressed his body against the door and took like 5 bullets, right, and gave his life so those kids could get out of that room. So the thought experiment was, well, obviously this is not an ordinary form of dessert. Clearly the students didn't deserve him to die for them that day. So I mean, let's be, so how are we going to deal with this limit case, right? And so they all kind of put on their thinking caps and start to say, well, we might be able to, isolate this as a sort of, as a sort of limit case of sorts, but there might be things within it that we might say that he should do, like he shouldn't run out of the room, or he shouldn't take the gun from the killer and kill all his students. Like there seem to be some very obvious ways we can slice and dice this situation. And I was appalled. I was like, I was feeling the way I am now about the story. I was just completely undone by this story that I'd never heard before, and completely taken aback by this man, this beautiful man who just gave his life for his students, right? And I was also appalled with the conversation, with philosophy of education, with all of these things. And so I went into my graduate work with a kind of strong sense of purpose, and it wasn't very direct, but it was that I'm not going to do that, right? I'm not going to sort of do analytic, discussions of real people dying for real people and stuff like that. And I didn't know what I was going to do, so I just started reading, and I ended up writing my first published paper on a return to love, discussing 2 philosophers, William James and Jean-Luc Marion. But the point of it was to basically bring out the aspect of, to say that love has something to do with pedagogy, with teaching, with education, and so I've continued to do that work. But after I published the paper, which again I had no clue that I wasn't supposed to be publishing papers my first year of grad school. I just wrote it and I submitted it to a journal. They had all the rules there, so I sent it and it got accepted. And so my advisor, I think, almost like had a stroke when I told him, "Hey, I just got an article published in Ed Theory." He was like, "What?" Anyway. Whenever I did that, though, I started becoming very defensive because I started to realize I kind of did something that was a little bit weird, and that was going to also put me up to scrutiny at a time where I wasn't really expecting that. I just wrote the paper, thought it was lovely, and sent it to them, and so I became very paranoid. So anytime I scanned a bookshelf, I'd always look for that book that I didn't cite, but that I probably should have, and start feeling really insecure. And I found that book on a bookstore in Half Price Books, and it was by Miguel de Unamuno, and the title was Amor y Pedagogia, which translates to love and pedagogy. And it's a story, and it's a very complicated story. It's sort of playing on Rousseau's Emile and on Don Quixote and on other writings of Unamuno. But the story basically goes like this. It's a story about a man, Don Avito Cascarral, who is described as a young man in love with progress, in love with social science and all progress. So he's a man who's just enamored with, this was written in 1902, right? So he's a man who's enamored with the ability of science and the enlightenment and where we've gotten so far in the enlightenment to kind of carry us all the way through. And so he basically says that there's this, what he calls a sociological pedagogy, that if it's applied to any young student, any young person, any child, that if they keep the application throughout their life, like medicine or something, that they'll surely turn out to be a genius, right? Now, in Unamuno's story, there's also this sort of allusion to the fool in literature. For Cervantes, of course, this would have been Sancho Panza. And so there's this kind of Sancho Panza walking around with Don Avito Cascarral saying, "¿Qué teorías, Don Avito? ¿Qué teorías?" Which is what theories? Oh, your theories. Oh, your amazing theories. They're so great. You're amazing. And he's sort of his disciple / fool / jester, what have you. And so Avito gets to work. He has a child, and this is very complicated. I'm going to gloss through it, oversimplify it. He has a child, and he applies the sociological pedagogy to the child. And at the very end of the story, as you can imagine, it doesn't work out. And the child has this moving soliloquy at the very end, right before the final line, where he says, and this is my translation, but I think it's a good one. It starts with, pudiste redimir. You were able to redeem. It says, you were able to redeem a man from pedagogy, to make a man from a candidate for genius. Because for Avito Cascarral, humans are candidates for genius, right? They're candidates for the sociological pedagogy. You apply the sociological pedagogy to them, and then they become a candidate for genius. And if you continue it and do it, then at some point they sort of bloom as geniuses. And that's what we want, right? Geniuses. It's like IBM, let's make a smarter planet, that kind of thing, right? So you were able to redeem a man from pedagogy, to make a man out of a candidate for genius. Out of a candidate for genius, yeah. May you make men of flesh and bone, with the companion of your life. May you make them in love, in love, in love, and not in pedagogy. And then the final line is, love was victorious, right? And that's the end of the story. Now, the reason I told this story in the middle of my sort of goofy autobiography is because I read that story as an autobiography. Those of you in my classes know I don't make a strong line between fact and fiction with regards to biographies, right? My favorite form of fiction, in fact, is autobiography, right? But I, in my life, grew up as well in higher education. I was the scholarship boy, right? I was the guy with the big scholarship who I've never not been paid to go to school, even now, right? Thankfully. But I've always had this sense of expectation that I was a sort of candidate for something. And it's not always the same candidate for genius. It's not always a sociological pedagogy. I grew up underneath the application of a very particular religious pedagogy. A religious pedagogy that I ultimately had my sort of redemptive moment to, and ironically in a double move found my way back to in a very different but similar way. But many of you live under an economic pedagogy, a pedagogy I'm not familiar with because I grew up, well, poor. But for many of you, you grow up under this economic pedagogy that says you're a candidate to not be poor or you're a candidate to be middle class. In fact, many ways, I think there are some disturbing elements of the way we treat you at Wabash where we almost turn you into candidates for economic pedagogies and sociological pedagogies and in some senses religious pedagogies and other kind of pedagogies, and all you have to do is go out and become a lawyer or a doctor, or if you're not really that smart, at least not anything too poor, right, and make your families proud and Wabash proud and give us money and all that kind of business. But the fact is whenever I read that story, I realized that this thing that had been moving me all my life, in particular with Coach Villa, with Dr. Spinnenweber, with all these different moments, and I left out one of my stories, but that's fine. So I get for not bringing notes, was that I'm not a candidate for pedagogy. I'm not a candidate for genius. I'm not a candidate for scholarship or any of these things. That's not who we are, first and foremost. Those are external whats, but they're not who we are. Who we are is something that I think we can break down in a very simple but absolutely fundamental and universal way, which is to say we're persons, right? And whenever that personhood gets lost amidst all of these applications of all of these pedagogies on us, and we begin to forget who we are. Whenever you think the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, is literally a question about who you're going to be, that whenever you're a lawyer, that's who you are. No, it's what you do. It's not who you are. I am not a professor. I profess, I'm doing it right now, but when it comes down to it, that's not who I am. I don't know who I am, to be honest. And at Wabash, I've had the distinct, sometimes painful, many times joyful, many times sorrowful, many times all these things, tragic, beautifully tragic experience of living with, dwelling with, being present with a bunch of other really confused people. A bunch of other people who, like the character in Unamuno's story, like the character in my own story, gets confused a lot about who they are and confuses that with things they do. And so I know right now at Wabash there are a lot of deep questions about the identity of teachers. There's a lot of serious questions about the identity of Wabash. And so I'd like to propose in a very simple way, coming out of my own self-disclosure, one very basic litmus test, one very basic criterion. What if we valued our teachers? What if we valued our students? What if we had valued our staff, our administrators, not only, but first and foremost, by their love? What if the sign of a teacher, of a student, of an administrator was, would so-and-so die for me? Now, I'm not going to, act like I'm a badass up here and think I'm going to die for you. When I listen to that story of the Holocaust survivor who gives his life, I'm humbled because I don't know. And anyone who speaks in the abstract about dying for people, I think is a good candidate for probably not going to do it, right? There are surprises, maybe, people you wouldn't expect to die for people might die for people. People you would expect to die for people, go away. But at the end of the day, I think that what we need as a community, in order to not just be a community of those who have nothing in common, but in order to be a true community, is we need to begin to question ourselves as to whether we are not just willing to learn together or to get jobs together or to give money together or even to drink together or what have you, but whether we're willing to die together. This was the implication that Lexi Hurl gave in the end of her talk whenever she talked about Rich Woods' talk. The implication of saying I would go to war with you is not necessarily a bellicose implication. It's simply the fact that I'm willing to, if necessary, die with you and perhaps for you. Those are serious words. I think Lexi was giving the same humble but generous implication when she said, I'm willing to go to jail with you, right? I'm willing to sort of lose it all, sell out for and with you. And during my time here, I've had ups and downs, and some might say more downs than ups, depending on who you ask, right? Is Billy Powers around, right? The point I'm making, though, is that whether they were ups or they were downs or sideways or one another or in one direction or the other, I can say that I've experienced a very real love here. Sometimes through hate, many times through love. But I wish, if I had one wish, is that there was more of it. Because I've also experienced a lot of apathy here. I've also experienced a lot of silence here. I've also experienced a lot of fear here. And I'm not speaking about just one person or another person or one event or no. I'm talking about from the moment I came. Because higher education is itself bred right now on fear. On a fear of love. Because love creates liabilities. And liabilities creates lawsuits. And lawsuits lose money. And we all know that the big fucking thing we're doing is money making, right? Well, no, that's not true. It's not true. Love is the only capital, the only social capital a community needs to survive. And when we confuse anything as far as social capital with love, then I think we become candidates for genius, or candidates for richness, or candidates for citizenship, or candidates for gentlemanliness. I'm not convinced you should be a gentleman if being a gentleman means to gentrify yourself and become so loaded up with bow ties and suits and politeness and not saying the wrong thing that you don't know how to reach out to someone who's suffering or to speak to someone who's not like you. And I'll end with this. There's another person who experienced this in a very rich and deep way in his life, and his name was Robert Nesta Marley. And I also got really into his work on account of one of my friends at Franciscan, Dallas Carter, who would refer to him as Blessed Robert Nesta Marley is what he would refer to him as. Because he was a baptized Ethiopian Orthodox, I believe, at the end of his life in Miami when he was dying of cancer. His whole family converted. And so at Franciscan, we all thought that was really cool. We had this connection because at Franciscan, we're not generally used to being cool, right? So anything we could attach ourselves to being cool was important. And Marley, throughout his life, because of his celebrity, acquired a certain kind of expectations about who he was supposed to be. The Rastafarians in Jamaica needed Marley to toe the line on everything from their violence to their hatred, to their anger, to their pain, to their activism. And Marley, at the end of his life, grew very tired of all these expectations, grew very tired of all of these senses of all these things he had to do. And at the end of his life, Marley, like the character in Unamuno's story, like myself with you today, was in need of redemption. And so he wrote this song, a redemption song, which I'm going to play. But I want you to now cash out my title. That I don't want to just say goodbye to you today or in the days to come. I want to say a goodbye that carries you from just the external, oh, good to see you, whatever, and carries us maybe forward in some different direction. It doesn't necessarily have to be ecclesially religious, but I do believe it has to be religious, at least religious in the sense that redemption means not stopping. It means, like Augustine would say, being restless. And it's precisely this restlessness that I think is embedded in some of your truisms, like Wabash always fights. But think of fighting here as a fight for redemption. And so this will be the last thing I'll say. Can you guys hear that? Okay. pirates, yes, they rob I. Stole I from the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pit. And my hands were made strong by the hands of the Almighty. We fought in this generation triumphantly. Won't you help me sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I've ever had are redemption songs. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. Have no fear of atomic energy or IBM, 'cause none of them can stop the time. And how long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book. Won't you help me sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I've ever had, because all I've ever had, because all I've ever had, all I've ever had, a redemption song. Thank you, Wabash.
Couple of announcements. Go see The Miser. It's over in the Fine Arts Center. It runs through Saturday, starts each night at 8 o'clock. It's a fantastic play, very funny. you should all attend. No TGIF this week. We'll do one last one next Friday. This Friday, track competes at Rose-Hulman. On Saturday, golf competes in Pennsylvania at the North Coast Athletic Conference Tournament. Baseball is home against Denison at 1 p.m. Tennis is home against Denison at 2 p.m. On Sunday, golf and baseball continue their events. Next week, there was not originally a chapel talk scheduled for the 11 o'clock hour. There now is one. 4 seniors, myself, Brian David, Peter Robbins, and Brandon Alford will be speaking next Thursday at 11:10. We'd like to see a lot of people out for that one. Without further ado, please rise and sing Old Wabash.